Part 1. Introduction to Caligula and the Roman Empire's Golden Lineage. The story of Caligula, Rome's third emperor, is one of transformation from anticipated hero to feared tyrant. Caligula's rule stands as a defining chapter in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first family of Rome, which was famed for establishing the empire and solidifying Rome's dominance across the Mediterranean world. The empire that Caligula inherited was at its zenith, thanks to the foundations laid by his great-grandfather, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, who set in motion a vision of imperial splendor that lasted long after his death. By the time Caligula came to power, Rome was the epicenter of a vast empire, thriving from its territories in Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. It was an empire characterized by complex military organization, elaborate cultural practices, and an extensive bureaucracy that facilitated its growth. As the third emperor, Caligula would inherit a lineage deeply rooted in the aspirations of his predecessors. Augustus, a masterful strategist, initiated policies that brought stability and prosperity after years of civil war. His successor, Emperor Tiberius, however, ruled with a more iron-fisted approach, creating a reputation for cruelty and mistrust. Tiberius' rule, though effective, marked a shift in the public's perception of Roman leadership. His calculated control of the empire was characterized by suspicion, repression, and the use of fear to command loyalty from his officials. Against this backdrop, young Caligula would grow up witnessing the darker side of imperial rule. Rome under the Julio-Claudian dynasty was not only powerful but also wealthy, controlling critical trade routes and resources that flowed into the empire from all corners of the known world. The wealth accumulated under Augustus's reign allowed for the construction of public buildings, monuments, and grand temples, symbolizing the strength and permanence of Roman rule. However, with this wealth came the risk of corruption, intrigue, and political tension. While Rome's image was one of grandeur, behind the scenes, a different picture emerged. The empire's foundation relied heavily on the emperor's stability and the unwavering loyalty of the Senate, army, and Praetorian Guard, a loyalty that was never guaranteed. Caligula's rise to the throne came at a time when the people of Rome were growing restless under Tiberius' rule. Many saw Caligula as a beacon of hope, a young figure poised to revive the ideals of Augustus and perhaps embody the virtues of his own father, Germanicus, a beloved military general who was admired by the Roman public. Germanicus had won the hearts of the people through his military victories and compassionate nature, setting a powerful legacy for his son. Upon Tiberius's death, the people and Senate alike looked to Caligula to usher in a new era of prosperity and stability. His ascent to power was celebrated as a long-awaited change and a potential return to the glories of Augustus's reign. The young emperor's initial popularity was overwhelming, and many believed that he would fulfill the hopes that the people placed in him. The promise of Caligula's rule was, however, quickly overshadowed by a shift in his behavior and temperament. What began as a hopeful transition soon spiraled into an era of fear and turmoil. While he inherited the throne with the adulation of the masses, the story of his rule would become synonymous with betrayal, excess, and madness. For a brief moment, though, Caligula symbolized Rome's optimism, a fresh start in the lineage of its emperors. His reign would mark one of the most infamous periods in Roman history, an era where the line between ruler and tyrant became disturbingly blurred. Part 2. The boy called Little Boots. The boy who would become known as Caligula, one of Rome's most infamous emperors, began his life as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. Born in 12 AD, he was the son of the highly respected General Germanicus, who was celebrated for his military achievements and loyalty to Rome. Caligula's childhood was one filled with both privilege and hardship. His family was not only famous but also closely connected to the Julio-Claudian lineage, with his father, Germanicus, being the nephew of Emperor Tiberius and a potential successor to the throne. From a young age, Caligula was surrounded by the expectations and pressures of his heritage, as he was groomed to understand the intricacies of leadership and military service. It was during Germanicus's military campaigns in Germania that Caligula earned his enduring nickname, Little Boots. As a child, he was dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with small military boots, known as Caligula. Soldiers in his father's army adored him for his charm and the joy he brought to the camps, calling him affectionately Caligula or Little Boots. The name stuck, and though he would later resent it, this identity became emblematic of his early years spent among soldiers and witnessing the military life firsthand. His time in the camps, surrounded by loyal soldiers and a strong-willed father, played a major role in shaping his sense of identity and the respect he initially garnered from the Roman military. However, the young Caligula's life took a dark turn when his father Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances in 19 AD. Many Romans, including his mother Agrippina the Elder, suspected that Emperor Tiberius had ordered Germanicus's death to eliminate a popular rival to his rule. The grief-stricken Agrippina was outspoken in her accusations, publicly denouncing Tiberius and challenging his authority. This strained relationship with the emperor led to devastating consequences for Caligula's family. Over the years, Tiberius would ruthlessly dismantle Agrippina's family, either imprisoning or exiling her and most of her children. By the time he was a teenager, Caligula had lost most of his family members to Tiberius's purges, and he was sent to live in isolation on the island of Capri under the watchful eye of Tiberius himself. This childhood of loss, betrayal, and confinement left deep psychological scars on Caligula. Living under Tiberius's rule meant navigating a world steeped in fear and suspicion. It was on Capri that Caligula likely witnessed Tiberius's dark side, as the emperor became infamous for his cruelty, paranoia, and rumored perversions. Some historians suggest that these experiences, combined with the trauma of his family's tragic fate, contributed to Caligula's later psychological instability. Isolated and constantly aware of his vulnerable position, Caligula learned to adapt, mastering the art of survival in a hostile environment where loyalty was fragile and alliances could turn fatal. Despite the harrowing circumstances, Caligula's youth on Capri also taught him to mask his emotions and play the role of a compliant grandson. He knew that one wrong move could lead to his own execution, so he became adept at pretending, hiding any resentment he held toward Tiberius and those responsible for his family's suffering. This duality became a core part of his character, a skill he would later wield as emperor to manipulate those around him. Even as a teenager, Caligula developed the ruthless pragmatism that would define his reign, learning to prioritize survival over trust or loyalty. By the time he left Capri and returned to Rome, Caligula was no longer the innocent Little Boots his father's soldiers had loved. Instead, he had become a hardened young man with a deep distrust of those around him and a keen sense of self-preservation. His early years under Tiberius's shadow transformed him in ways that would soon become apparent to the people of Rome. Caligula was ready to take on the empire that awaited him, but the seeds of his complex, turbulent rule had already been planted. The trauma, ambition, and ruthlessness instilled in him during these formative years would soon emerge, shaping his tragic and infamous legacy. Part 3. A traumatic youth in the shadows of Tiberius. Caligula's youth on the island of Capri under Emperor Tiberius was marked by profound isolation and exposure to the darker sides of Roman power. When he arrived on Capri, he was barely a teenager, living under the direct supervision of the emperor responsible for the destruction of his family. Tiberius, whose rule was infamous for its severity and cruelty, maintained a secluded and suspicious life on Capri, surrounded by a small circle of trusted advisors and guards. The atmosphere on the island was rife with paranoia, intrigue, and violence, shaping the young Caligula in complex and lasting ways. Historians have noted that Tiberius's retreat to Capri allowed him to exercise an unusual degree of personal control over his chosen successors, including Caligula. Living under Tiberius's watchful eye, Caligula quickly learned to mask his emotions and adapt to an environment of constant danger. He had no allies on the island, no family members to confide in, and no friends he could trust. His survival depended on his ability to placate Tiberius, who was notorious for his arbitrary punishments and lethal suspicion. To survive, Caligula cultivated a false persona of loyalty and humility, hiding any resentment he harbored toward the emperor. During his time on Capri, Caligula witnessed a side of Tiberius that shocked even his hardened contemporaries. Tiberius's cruelty was notorious, and he was rumored to indulge in twisted entertainments and brutal punishments. The young Caligula, surrounded by these displays of tyranny and excess, began to absorb the lessons of power and fear. Living in an environment where life could be snuffed out at the emperor's whim, Caligula saw firsthand the depths of depravity that absolute power could inspire. This exposure would later influence his own approach to ruling, as he developed a fascination with cruelty and the use of fear to control others. Tiberius's treatment of Caligula was complex. On one hand, the emperor showed some degree of favor toward his young relative, perhaps seeing in him a potential successor who had endured and survived, as he himself had. But Tiberius also tested Caligula, perhaps seeking to ensure that the young man had the strength and resilience required to rule. There are accounts of Tiberius introducing Caligula to disturbing forms of entertainment and forcing him to witness executions and public humiliations. Some historians suggest that this exposure might have desensitized Caligula to suffering and laid the groundwork for his later sadistic tendencies. Capri became a training ground of sorts for Caligula, albeit one that trained him in manipulation, cruelty, and self-preservation over compassion or statesmanship. Without family support or allies, he became adept at reading people and situations, learning how to maneuver in an environment where trust was a liability rather than an asset. This mastery of deceit, acquired under Tiberius's mentorship, later emerged as a hallmark of his leadership style, allowing him to present a benign face to the public while executing brutal and often arbitrary punishments behind closed doors. By the time Caligula left Capri to ascend to the throne, he had become an enigma to the Roman public. They saw him as a surviving remnant of Germanicus's legacy, unaware of the twisted lessons he had absorbed under Tiberius's rule. His time in Capri was transformative, marking a shift from an innocent boy to a hardened young man, one who understood both the power and peril of ruling an empire. The psychological toll of this experience would linger, fueling the erratic and violent reign that would soon follow. Caligula left Capri with his life, but he would never leave behind the influence of the twisted emperor who had taught him how to wield power. Part 4. The Accidental Emperor. Caligula's Rise to Power. Caligula's unexpected rise to power marked the beginning of what many Romans hoped would be a return to stability and prosperity. After years of living under Tiberius's watchful eye and enduring the harsh lessons of Capri, Caligula was summoned back to Rome in 37 AD, where he would soon be named as Tiberius's successor. Tiberius, who had been aging and increasingly reclusive, had left Rome yearning for a young, dynamic leader, someone who could revive the optimism of Augustus's early reign. Caligula was, to many Romans, the perfect choice, a descendant of the beloved Germanicus and a fresh face to replace Tiberius's legacy of fear and isolation. Tiberius's death itself was shrouded in mystery and suspicion. Some sources claim that Caligula may have had a hand in hastening the emperor's demise, perhaps with the help of the powerful Praetorian Guard. According to these accounts, Tiberius fell gravely ill, and as he lay near death, Caligula and the Praetorian commander, Naevius Sertorius Macro, took advantage of the situation. When it seemed as though Tiberius might recover, Caligula allegedly ordered his suffocation, ensuring that his rise to the throne would proceed without delay. While these accounts remain debated, the story speaks to the tense atmosphere surrounding Caligula's accession and the power plays that marked the Roman political landscape. Caligula's early days as emperor were filled with celebrations and widespread joy across Rome. The young ruler seemed poised to deliver on the promise of a renewed and prosperous empire. He offered generous handouts to the people, enacted public works projects, and organized lavish spectacles that captivated the masses. In these early months, Caligula appeared almost as a savior, reviving the ideals of his father Germanicus and portraying himself as a champion of the people. His charisma, charm, and willingness to engage with the public created an image of accessibility and magnanimity, qualities that distinguished him sharply from his predecessor. The Senate, too, initially supported Caligula's reign. In contrast to Tiberius, who had often sidelined or mistrusted the Senate, Caligula sought to re-establish strong relationships with the political elite. He reinstated certain privileges and engaged with senatorial traditions, giving the impression that his administration would prioritize stability and collaboration. These early actions fostered an image of harmony within Rome's highest political circles, and the Senate seemed, for a time, to embrace the new emperor as a partner rather than an adversary. Caligula's rise to power, however, was not without its critics or challenges. Some members of the elite viewed his ascent with skepticism, fearing that his youth and inexperience might lead to instability. His quick rise and early popularity threatened powerful figures accustomed to navigating Tiberius's cautious and ruthless rule. As the months progressed, these tensions would gradually surface, but in the early stages of his reign, Caligula appeared secure and beloved by both the people and the Senate. Caligula's reign began with boundless promise, a seeming restoration of Roman values and traditions after years of repressive rule under Tiberius. The young emperor's popularity reached extraordinary heights, and many in Rome dared to hope for an era reminiscent of Augustus's golden age. Yet, as history would soon reveal, this optimistic beginning was only a brief prelude to one of the most tumultuous reigns in Roman history. Beneath the facade of charm and charisma lay a complex personality, shaped by trauma and ambition, that would soon unravel in a dramatic turn toward paranoia, excess, and cruelty. Caligula's rule had barely begun, but the seeds of both admiration and mistrust had already been planted. The accidental emperor, thrust into power by the circumstances of his lineage and Tiberius's death, now faced the daunting task of ruling an empire with his unpredictable nature. As he took his first steps into power, the journey toward infamy was only just beginning. Part 5. The Golden Start. Caligula's early reforms and generosity. For a brief period, Caligula's reign seemed to deliver on its promise, ushering in a golden start that restored hope and excitement across the Roman Empire. His first months in power were marked by sweeping reforms and acts of generosity that endeared him to the people and reassured the Senate. To the Romans, Caligula appeared as a benevolent and forward-thinking ruler, ready to address the needs of his citizens and ensure the prosperity of the empire. He wasted no time in proving his commitment to Rome, creating a series of policies that aimed to undo the damage caused by Tiberius's oppressive rule and win the favor of the public. One of Caligula's first acts was to grant amnesty to many of those whom Tiberius had imprisoned on charges of treason and dissent. This decision was widely celebrated as a bold and compassionate move, signaling the end of Tiberius's culture of fear and persecution. By releasing political prisoners, Caligula demonstrated his willingness to heal the divisions that had plagued the empire under Tiberius's suspicious and punitive leadership. The people viewed this act as a symbol of hope and unity, an opportunity to move forward and rebuild trust in the imperial office. Caligula also enacted generous financial policies that further boosted his popularity. He distributed substantial amounts of money to the people, organizing donatives for the Praetorian Guard, soldiers, and public officials. The emperor's handouts were seen as gestures of goodwill, and these gifts sparked waves of gratitude among the recipients. To support these policies, Caligula opened his own personal coffers, demonstrating a level of sacrifice and devotion that endeared him to the Roman populace. This display of wealth, combined with his willingness to share it, cemented his image as a ruler with the people's best interests at heart. In addition to these financial reforms, Caligula invested heavily in public works, commissioning new buildings, roads, and aqueducts. His efforts revitalized Rome's infrastructure, signaling his commitment to the city's development and beauty. The emperor also organized grand public events, including games, festivals, and spectacles, which delighted the people and showcased the splendor of the imperial court. These celebrations were more than mere entertainment. They represented a renewed focus on Roman culture, offering the public a sense of belonging and pride. Caligula's cultural projects brought people together, strengthening the bond between ruler and citizen in the early days of his reign. Even the Senate, which had been cautious in its approach to the young emperor, initially embraced these reforms. Caligula's policy of generosity and his commitment to Rome's infrastructure won him allies among the political elite, who saw him as a stabilizing force after Tiberius's divisive rule. The Senate appreciated his respect for traditional practices and his attention to Rome's welfare. For a time, it seemed that Caligula's administration might actually foster a productive relationship between the imperial court and the senatorial class. However, as Caligula's lavish spending continued, concerns began to emerge about the sustainability of these reforms. While the people reveled in the newfound wealth and festivities, others worried about the potential economic strain his policies could place on the empire's treasury. Caligula's generosity was boundless, but it was also expensive, raising questions about whether Rome's finances could sustain such grand projects in the long term. Despite these underlying concerns, Caligula's reputation as a generous and benevolent ruler continued to flourish in his early reign. For a moment, Rome had found a leader who seemed to genuinely care for the welfare of his people. Caligula's golden start, while brief, represented a unique and promising chapter in his reign. But the emperor's early generosity masked a growing ambition and a latent cruelty that would soon shatter the peace he had brought to Rome. As he grew more comfortable in his position, Caligula's darker tendencies began to emerge, foreshadowing the turbulent and chaotic rule that would soon engulf the empire. Part 6. The Turning Point: Caligula's Illness and Transformation. The initial period of Caligula's rule, marked by generosity and optimism, would take a dark and fateful turn due to an illness that struck the young emperor in 37 AD. Only months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill with a mysterious fever that left him bedridden and close to death. The illness came on suddenly, shocking the Roman people and filling the city with anxiety and fear. Rumors spread quickly, as citizens and senators alike prayed and made offerings to the gods for his recovery. The fever left Caligula weak and vulnerable, and for a time, it seemed as if his life, and the promise of his rule, might be cut tragically short. The exact nature of Caligula's illness remains unclear, but historians agree that it marked a pivotal shift in his personality. Some speculate that he suffered from a severe fever or brain infection, while others believe the illness may have caused lasting neurological damage. Whatever the cause, Caligula emerged from his sickbed as a changed man. His once charismatic demeanor became darker and more unpredictable, and the compassion he had shown in his early reign seemed to give way to paranoia and cruelty. This transformation was so profound that many of his contemporaries began to question his sanity, believing that the illness had fundamentally altered his mind. The people of Rome initially rejoiced when Caligula recovered, seeing it as a miracle and a blessing. His survival was celebrated across the empire, and the young emperor himself viewed his recovery as a divine sign of favor from the gods. But the man who returned to the throne after his illness was no longer the generous ruler the people had known. Caligula became increasingly erratic, displaying signs of megalomania and grandiosity that alarmed his advisors and those closest to him. His relationship with the Senate, once marked by respect, began to sour as he grew more suspicious of those around him. One of the first signs of Caligula's change was his newfound obsession with his own divinity. He began demanding to be worshipped as a living god, ordering temples and statues to be erected in his honor. The emperor's fascination with his godlike status disturbed both the Senate and the people, who were unaccustomed to such blatant displays of hubris from their ruler. This shift in Caligula's behavior marked the beginning of a tyrannical reign in which he would push the boundaries of Roman tradition and challenge the limits of his own authority. His sense of invincibility, fueled by his survival of the illness, only heightened his arrogance and disregard for traditional Roman values. As his reign continued, Caligula's erratic behavior became more pronounced. He began to indulge in acts of cruelty and excess, seemingly reveling in the fear and discomfort he caused among his advisors and subjects. Many within the empire began to speak of him in whispers, fearful of his increasingly unpredictable and violent outbursts. The transformation from the compassionate leader to the tyrant was swift, and Rome would soon feel the full force of his unchecked ambition and cruelty. Caligula's illness marked a crucial turning point in his life and reign. Where there had once been hope for a new golden age, there now lingered a pervasive sense of dread and uncertainty. The emperor's descent into madness had begun, and the city of Rome watched helplessly as he grew more distant from reality. Caligula, now convinced of his own divine right to rule, began to wield his power without restraint, setting the stage for the dark years that would follow. Part 7. God Complex: Caligula's Descent into Megalomania. Following his recovery, Caligula's belief in his own divinity escalated dramatically, leading him to demand that he be worshipped as a living god. This conviction was unprecedented in Roman history, as no emperor before him had dared to assert his divine status so openly and aggressively. Caligula's self-deification challenged the foundations of Roman tradition, which held that emperors could only achieve divinity after death, through the Senate's official recognition. By claiming to be a god while still alive, Caligula defied centuries of Roman custom and asserted his absolute authority over the state, the people, and even the gods themselves. Caligula's god complex manifested in increasingly disturbing ways. He ordered statues of himself to be placed in temples, demanding that citizens offer sacrifices and prayers in his honor. His most controversial act came when he attempted to place a statue of himself in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a move that outraged the local population and nearly sparked a rebellion. The emperor's insistence on being worshipped created tension throughout the empire, as many of his subjects found his demands sacrilegious and deeply offensive. Yet Caligula showed no concern for these dissenting opinions, believing himself above the reproach of mortals and answerable only to his own desires. The emperor's god complex also influenced his relationships with those closest to him. He surrounded himself with sycophants who flattered his ego and encouraged his delusions of grandeur. Those who questioned his divinity or failed to show the proper reverence quickly found themselves at risk of punishment. Senators, advisors, and even members of the Praetorian Guard feared his wrath, as Caligula displayed a willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his authority. His obsession with his own divinity drove him to isolate himself from reality, cutting off the few voices of reason that might have curbed his excesses. In his quest to cement his godlike image, Caligula engaged in lavish displays of wealth and power. He organized extravagant banquets, festivals, and public games, often bankrupting the imperial treasury to fund his spectacles. These events, while intended to reinforce his image as a divine ruler, placed a significant financial strain on the empire and alienated many within the Senate, who viewed his spending as reckless and unsustainable. Caligula's displays of wealth served only to feed his growing megalomania, as he believed that his power and wealth were evidence of his divine favor. The emperor's god complex extended to his personal appearance as well. He began to adopt the attire and symbols associated with various deities, often dressing as Jupiter, Apollo, or other gods during public events. This behavior was both bizarre and unsettling to the Roman people, who were unaccustomed to seeing their ruler dressed as a deity. Caligula's blending of imperial and divine imagery blurred the lines between emperor and god, leaving many unsure how to react to his unprecedented display of arrogance. This obsession with divine imagery marked a further step in his descent into madness, as he grew increasingly detached from the practical responsibilities of ruling and focused solely on his self-image. As his megalomania deepened, Caligula's actions became more erratic and unpredictable. The emperor's demands for worship, combined with his lavish displays of wealth and erratic behavior, isolated him from his subjects and fueled resentment within the Senate and military. Those who had once viewed him with admiration now saw him as a dangerous despot, a ruler who placed his own ego above the well-being of the empire. The god complex that had come to define Caligula's rule would ultimately lead to his downfall, as he alienated those who had once supported him and created a climate of fear and resentment within Rome. Rome had never seen an emperor like Caligula, a ruler who believed himself to be above both man and God. His descent into madness and megalomania left the empire on the brink of chaos, with a populace that no longer recognized the man they had once celebrated as their savior. Caligula's god complex would prove to be both his defining trait and his undoing, as the people of Rome grew increasingly disillusioned with the ruler who saw himself as a deity. The story of Caligula's reign was now a tale of hubris and excess, a cautionary example of what could happen when absolute power went unchecked in the hands of a man who believed himself to be divine. Part 8. The Isolation of Power. Caligula's relationship with the Senate. As Caligula's god complex intensified, his relationship with the Roman Senate deteriorated rapidly, creating a dangerous rift between the emperor and the empire's ruling elite. Initially, the Senate had welcomed Caligula with open arms, hoping that his rule would bring stability and cooperation after the isolationist tendencies of Tiberius. However, as Caligula grew more erratic, his treatment of the Senate became increasingly hostile, marking a sharp turn from the respect he had once shown. The emperor's growing paranoia and authoritarian rule alienated senators, who found themselves sidelined and degraded by Caligula's increasingly outrageous demands. One of the primary sources of tension was Caligula's disdain for traditional senatorial privileges. He stripped senators of many of their customary roles and responsibilities, refusing to consult them on important matters and often mocking them in public. In some cases, he humiliated senators by forcing them to participate in demeaning acts, such as running alongside his chariot or performing tasks meant for servants. These acts were intended to reinforce Caligula's power and emphasize his authority over the Senate, but they only succeeded in generating resentment and anger among Rome's political elite. Caligula's unpredictable behavior created an atmosphere of fear within the Senate. Senators were reluctant to challenge him openly, fearing that even the slightest opposition could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution. Some of Caligula's most loyal senators, who had previously supported him, began to distance themselves, wary of the emperor's violent temper and erratic decision-making. Caligula's reign of intimidation ensured that the Senate could not act as an effective check on his power, leaving the emperor free to govern without accountability. This breakdown in the relationship between emperor and Senate marked a significant shift in Roman politics, as the balance of power tilted entirely in favor of the emperor. To assert his dominance further, Caligula began demanding that senators address him as a god and perform acts of worship in his honor. Many senators found these demands deeply offensive and insulting, as they violated traditional Roman values that held the emperor accountable to both the Senate and the people. Yet few dared to defy him openly, as Caligula's wrath was swift and merciless. His demands for worship were not merely acts of hubris. They represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Roman rule, as the emperor sought to elevate himself above all earthly and political constraints. The Senate's role as a governing body was eroding rapidly, replaced by a system in which absolute power resided solely with the emperor. Caligula's growing isolation was compounded by his distrust of those closest to him. He became suspicious of his own advisors, often accusing them of treason and ordering their executions without evidence. This climate of fear and mistrust made it nearly impossible for the Senate to function effectively, as senators feared that any attempt to advise or question the emperor could lead to their deaths. The once collaborative relationship between the Senate and the emperor had devolved into a one-sided dynamic of obedience and submission, with senators reduced to little more than subjects in Caligula's court. This isolation of power would have dire consequences for the stability of Caligula's reign. By severing his ties with the Senate and ruling through intimidation, Caligula created a power structure that was vulnerable to collapse. The emperor's refusal to listen to advice or acknowledge the authority of the Senate left him without allies in times of crisis, as those who might have supported him were alienated or eliminated. As Caligula continued to govern with an iron fist, His unchecked authority and disregard for the Senate set the stage for the conflicts and betrayals that would eventually lead to his downfall. The emperor's relationship with the Senate, once marked by respect and cooperation, had turned into a battleground of ego and dominance. Caligula's alienation of Rome's ruling class not only weakened his rule, but also eroded the foundations of Roman governance. The isolation of power that defined his reign would ultimately contribute to his tragic fate, as the Senate, resentful and fearful, began to plot against the ruler they had once embraced. Rome was now a city divided, with a ruler who saw himself as a god and a Senate that longed for the return of order and stability. Part 9. The People's Emperor. Caligula's complex relationship with the public. Despite his growing tensions with the Senate, Caligula's relationship with the Roman people remained more complex and multifaceted. The emperor was known for his extravagance and public displays, and he frequently organized lavish spectacles and games to entertain the masses. In doing so, he crafted an image of himself as a people's emperor, a ruler who understood the desires of his citizens and spared no expense to keep them entertained. Caligula's commitment to public entertainment became one of the defining features of his reign, a way to maintain his popularity among the people even as he alienated Rome's elite. Caligula's spectacles were unparalleled in their extravagance and scale. He organized elaborate gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances, often featuring rare and exotic animals from across the empire. These events were staged with unprecedented grandeur, drawing enormous crowds and creating a sense of excitement and wonder among the people. Caligula spared no expense in arranging these spectacles, seeing them as a way to secure his reputation as a generous and accessible ruler. The people's enthusiasm for these games and events reflected a public eager for distraction and entertainment, especially after the years of austerity under Tiberius. The emperor's public works projects also contributed to his image as a people's emperor. Caligula initiated several ambitious building projects, including aqueducts, temples, and public buildings that were intended to beautify Rome and improve the lives of its citizens. These projects provided jobs and resources to the people, reinforcing Caligula's popularity among the lower classes. However, these massive undertakings placed a considerable strain on the imperial treasury, and critics within the Senate viewed his spending as reckless and unsustainable. Yet for the common people, Caligula's public works were a tangible demonstration of his commitment to Rome's prosperity. Caligula's generosity extended beyond grand events and public works. He was known for his direct financial distributions to the people, often throwing coins into the crowd during public appearances or providing funds for those in need. These acts of generosity endeared him to the masses, who saw him as a ruler willing to share his wealth and engage directly with his citizens. In the eyes of the public, Caligula was a stark contrast to Tiberius, who had largely ignored the needs and desires of the common people. This public persona helped shield Caligula from some of the criticism he faced from the Senate and the elite, as many ordinary citizens viewed him as a benevolent figure despite his increasingly erratic behavior. However, Caligula's relationship with the public was not without its darker aspects. His demand for divine worship extended to the people, as he expected them to recognize his godlike status and honor him as a deity. For many Romans, this demand was deeply unsettling, as it violated traditional beliefs and values. While the spectacles and distributions may have earned him temporary adoration, his insistence on being worshipped as a god alienated some of his subjects and sparked rumors about his mental state. The public's admiration was tempered by a growing unease, as Caligula's erratic behavior began to overshadow his initial acts of generosity and largesse. Despite these underlying tensions, Caligula's bond with the people remained stronger than his relationship with the Senate. Many Romans continued to see him as a people's emperor, a leader who cared for his citizens and provided them with excitement and entertainment. This perception allowed him to retain a certain level of support among the populace, even as he grew more detached from reality and more isolated within his own court. Caligula's ability to connect with the public, however superficial, highlighted the complexity of his rule, a reign that was simultaneously adored and feared, celebrated and condemned. Caligula's relationship with the people served as both a source of strength and a potential weakness. His popularity with the masses shielded him from immediate threats, but his extravagance and insistence on divine worship would ultimately prove unsustainable. The people's emperor, despite his popularity, could not escape the growing resentment of the Senate or the whispers of discontent that began to circulate among Rome's citizens. The emperor's dual image, as both a generous ruler and a mad tyrant, would continue to define his rule, creating a legacy marked by extremes. The tension between his public persona and private reality foreshadowed the tragic and chaotic end that would soon engulf Caligula's reign. Part 10. The Road to Despotism. Caligula's increasing paranoia and brutality. As Caligula's rule progressed, his paranoia and distrust of those around him escalated to unprecedented levels. His illness, followed by his self-proclaimed divinity, seemed to deepen his suspicion of those closest to him, transforming him into a ruler who trusted no one. Friends, family, and advisors all fell under his scrutiny, as Caligula began to see threats everywhere and ruthlessly removed anyone he perceived as a danger. This heightened sense of paranoia and the extreme measures he took to eliminate supposed enemies marked the beginning of his descent into true despotism. His behavior grew increasingly unpredictable and brutal, alienating him further from those within his inner circle and instilling fear across Rome. Caligula's obsession with loyalty led him to demand absolute obedience and submission from everyone in his court. He frequently tested his advisors and attendants, issuing bizarre commands to see if they would comply without question. Those who failed these tests or even hesitated often faced severe punishment. The emperor's violent outbursts became notorious, with tales of him ordering executions on a whim or condemning individuals to torture simply for looking at him the wrong way. His court became a place of fear, where those closest to him were forced to perform constant acts of submission to avoid incurring his wrath. The emperor's paranoia extended to his own family, whom he came to view as potential rivals. His relationship with his sisters, once close and affectionate, soured as Caligula began to suspect them of plotting against him. He exiled or executed relatives he deemed disloyal, removing potential threats to his authority regardless of familial ties. This suspicion of his own blood underscored the depth of Caligula's isolation and mistrust, as he began to see enemies everywhere, even within his own household. The once loving family bonds were replaced by a cold and deadly mistrust, further isolating Caligula within his self-made cocoon of power and paranoia. Caligula's distrust of the Senate only intensified as he began to suspect senators of conspiring against him. He launched investigations and trials against prominent senators, accusing them of treason with little or no evidence. Many senators were executed or forced into exile, and their property was often confiscated to enrich the imperial treasury. This campaign of persecution effectively silenced any remaining opposition within the Senate, as the surviving members lived in constant fear of incurring the emperor's suspicion. Caligula's paranoia and brutality effectively turned the Senate into a submissive body, stripped of its power and reduced to a mere symbol of what it had once been. The emperor's increasingly erratic behavior extended beyond the palace, as reports of his cruelty reached the general populace. Stories circulated about his cruelty and capriciousness, with rumors of executions and bizarre punishments becoming common knowledge. These acts of brutality shocked and horrified the people of Rome, who had initially celebrated Caligula as a charismatic and generous leader. Caligula's transformation from people's emperor to a paranoid tyrant left the citizens disillusioned, as they watched their once promising ruler descend into madness and violence. The people's support, once a foundation of his rule, began to erode as fear and resentment replaced admiration. Caligula's descent into despotism was fueled by his unchecked power and growing detachment from reality. His paranoia, combined with his belief in his own divinity, created a ruler who felt he was above any law or restriction. This belief in his absolute authority allowed him to justify his cruelty and violence, as he viewed himself as a god enforcing his will on a world he deemed inferior. The emperor's descent into paranoia and brutality would prove to be his undoing, as the fear and resentment he inspired would eventually turn against him. The road to despotism that Caligula traveled was one paved with fear, suspicion, and cruelty. His transformation from a beloved leader to a tyrant reflected the dangers of unchecked power and the corrosive effects of paranoia on a ruler's mind. As he isolated himself further from those who might have tempered his excesses, Caligula sealed his fate, creating a reign defined by brutality and mistrust. The emperor's journey into darkness was nearly complete, and Rome braced itself for the inevitable consequences of his violent and paranoid rule. Part 11. The Madness of Power. Caligula's Bizarre Decrees and Eccentricities. Caligula's descent into madness manifested not only in acts of cruelty, but also in bizarre decrees and eccentric behavior that baffled both his advisors and the people of Rome. The emperor's god complex and unchecked power led him to make decisions that defied all logic, often pushing the boundaries of Roman tradition and decency. As Caligula's erratic actions became more frequent, many began to question his sanity, as he introduced policies and made declarations that seemed rooted in fantasy rather than reason. His eccentricities highlighted the extent to which he had become detached from reality, creating a surreal atmosphere of chaos within the empire. One of Caligula's most infamous acts was his decision to appoint his horse, Incitatus, to the position of consul. This act, while initially viewed as a joke, became a serious matter as Caligula went to great lengths to formalize his horse's position. He provided Incitatus with a marble stall, an ivory manger, and even invited the horse to dine with him in his palace. For Caligula, the appointment symbolized his disdain for the Senate, as he demonstrated that even his horse could perform the duties of a senator. This act, while humorous to some, underscored Caligula's contempt for Rome's political institutions and further isolated him from the Senate. Caligula's strange behavior extended to his interactions with the gods. He ordered that statues of various deities be brought from across the empire and had their heads removed, replacing them with his own likeness. This act of sacrilege shocked the Roman public and alienated religious leaders, who viewed it as a direct affront to the gods themselves. Caligula's insistence on portraying himself as a living god not only offended the people, but also showcased his detachment from traditional Roman religious values. His actions revealed a ruler who had lost touch with reality, believing himself to be equal to, or even above, the deities worshipped by his people. Another bizarre decree involved the construction of a bridge across the Bay of Baiae, an extravagant and costly project that served no practical purpose. Caligula reportedly ordered the bridge's construction simply to defy a prophecy that claimed he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. The emperor completed the bridge and famously rode across it, viewing the act as a symbolic display of his power over fate and destiny. The project, however, drained the imperial treasury and left Rome's financial situation even more precarious. This act of extravagance served only to highlight Caligula's obsession with proving his divinity and power, regardless of the cost. Caligula's bizarre decrees extended to matters of governance, as he issued laws that were often arbitrary and incomprehensible. He would enact a law one day, only to revoke it the next, leaving both the Senate and the citizens in a constant state of confusion. This erratic approach to governance destabilized Rome, as officials struggled to keep up with the emperor's whims and ever-changing policies. The chaos created by Caligula's unpredictable decrees reflected the emperor's detachment from the realities of leadership, as he seemed more interested in asserting his dominance than in maintaining order or stability within the empire. The emperor's eccentricities and bizarre decrees shocked and bewildered the people of Rome. What had once been admiration and support for the young ruler now turned into dismay and disbelief, as citizens struggled to understand the man who ruled over them. Caligula's actions served as a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute power, as his unchecked authority allowed him to indulge in fantasies and whims that had real consequences for the empire. The people of Rome, once hopeful for a new era of peace and prosperity, now found themselves at the mercy of a ruler who appeared to be driven by madness and self-indulgence. Caligula's bizarre decrees and eccentricities marked a turning point in his reign, as they revealed the full extent of his madness and detachment from reality. His reign, once filled with promise, had devolved into a chaotic display of power, cruelty, and eccentricity as he imposed his will on Rome with little regard for tradition, stability, or reason. The emperor's actions left Rome reeling, as citizens and officials alike struggled to cope with the erratic and unpredictable nature of Caligula's rule. His bizarre behavior would leave a lasting impression on Roman history, forever marking Caligula as one of the most eccentric and controversial figures to ever sit on the throne. Part 12. The Great Economic Strain. Caligula's Financial Recklessness. Caligula's reign of extravagance and unpredictable policies began to take a severe toll on Rome's finances. Early in his rule, Caligula inherited a treasury that had been carefully managed by his predecessor Tiberius, who, despite his faults, was a frugal and cautious ruler. However, Caligula's constant pursuit of lavish spectacles, ambitious building projects, and eccentric displays of power quickly drained the wealth that Rome had accumulated. His disregard for financial prudence, combined with his need for constant adulation, created an economic strain that would have devastating effects on the empire's stability and prosperity. Caligula's spending was often directed toward projects that served little purpose beyond satisfying his ego and sense of grandeur. He ordered the construction of opulent palaces, grandiose temples, and even entire cities dedicated to himself, many of which remained unfinished due to their immense costs. In his quest to prove his divinity and authority, Caligula spared no expense, funding statues, monuments, and festivals meant to glorify his rule. The resources that should have gone toward maintaining the empire's infrastructure and defenses were instead funneled into these costly, self-serving endeavors, leaving Rome vulnerable to future challenges and crises. One of Caligula's most financially disastrous projects was his attempt to conquer the English Channel in a bizarre, symbolic military campaign. Rather than launching an actual invasion of Britain, he directed his troops to gather seashells along the shore, claiming they were spoils of the seas and a gift from Neptune, the god of the ocean. This absurd campaign cost Rome dearly, as Caligula diverted resources, men, and funds into a display that left his generals and soldiers baffled. The campaign failed to bring any tangible benefit to Rome, serving only to further deplete the empire's resources and strengthen the perception of Caligula's madness. As the imperial treasury ran low, Caligula resorted to increasingly desperate measures to refill it. He imposed heavy taxes on the provinces and the people of Rome, burdening them with exorbitant fees that impacted daily life and commerce. Merchants, artisans, and even farmers felt the strain of Caligula's relentless demands for wealth, as he seized estates, confiscated property, and auctioned off the valuable belongings of those who had fallen out of favor with him. This economic pressure sowed seeds of resentment across the empire, as citizens struggled to make ends meet while watching the emperor squander their wealth on his personal indulgences. The financial strain reached the upper classes as well, as Caligula targeted wealthy citizens and senators, accusing them of various crimes to justify the seizure of their assets. Those who failed to prove their loyalty were forced to surrender their wealth, which Caligula then used to fund his lavish lifestyle. The emperor's indiscriminate confiscation of wealth created an atmosphere of fear within the upper echelons of Roman society, as even the wealthiest and most influential citizens felt vulnerable to Caligula's unpredictable whims. This economic strain alienated the elite, further isolating Caligula from those who might have otherwise supported his rule. Caligula's financial recklessness destabilized the empire's economy and threatened the livelihoods of his people. His disregard for fiscal responsibility and obsession with luxury created a chasm between the emperor and his citizens, as ordinary Romans saw their taxes increase while their quality of life deteriorated. The once prosperous empire, weakened by Caligula's extravagance, found itself struggling to sustain even basic functions, as funds meant for essential services were squandered on the emperor's lavish excesses. Rome's economic stability, once a source of pride and strength, was now in jeopardy, eroded by Caligula's unrestrained spending and disregard for fiscal prudence. This economic strain would have lasting repercussions, as Caligula's actions set a dangerous precedent for future emperors who would struggle to balance the needs of the state with the temptation of absolute power. His financial recklessness served as a cautionary tale, highlighting the fragility of an empire that placed unchecked power in the hands of a single ruler. Rome's treasury, once a symbol of the empire's strength, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, drained by the ambitions and excesses of an emperor who saw himself as above any earthly limitations. Caligula's economic policies would leave Rome vulnerable, its coffers empty and its citizens disillusioned, as they watched their leader squander the empire's wealth on a legacy that was increasingly defined by madness and megalomania. Part 13. The Threat Within. Plots and Betrayals in Caligula's Court. As Caligula's paranoia and brutality intensified, discontent began to simmer within the ranks of his own court. The emperor's erratic behavior, economic excesses, and ruthless treatment of both the Senate and his advisors created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, leading to a growing number of secret plots and alliances against him. The once loyal men who had supported his rise to power now found themselves questioning their allegiance, as Caligula's rule descended further into chaos and violence. Betrayal and intrigue became the order of the day, as Rome's elite searched for a way to end the reign of the increasingly unstable emperor. The discontent within Caligula's court was fueled by the emperor's treatment of those closest to him. High-ranking officials and advisors who had once enjoyed his favor now lived in constant fear of falling out with him, as even the smallest mistake could result in imprisonment, exile, or execution. Caligula's cruelty and unpredictable nature left his inner circle constantly on edge, uncertain when or why they might face his wrath. This climate of fear led many to turn against him, as they saw no alternative to removing a ruler who had become both a danger to them and to Rome itself. The Senate, long humiliated and marginalized by Caligula, became a hotbed of conspiracy. Senators who had been stripped of their power and influence saw an opportunity to reclaim their status by plotting against the emperor. Their resentment, compounded by the heavy taxes and confiscations that Caligula had imposed, motivated them to seek alliances with other disaffected groups. Senators who had once hesitated to act now saw no other choice, as they realized that Caligula's reign posed an existential threat to the stability of Rome. The Senate's disillusionment with the emperor set the stage for an unprecedented alliance of Rome's elite against their ruler. Among Caligula's personal guards and attendants, dissatisfaction also grew. The emperor's frequent demands for loyalty tests and displays of submission had worn down even his most devoted followers, leaving them disillusioned and wary. Members of the Praetorian Guard, who had sworn to protect the emperor, began to question their loyalty as they witnessed the chaos and fear that his rule had brought. Caligula's mistreatment of his own guards, coupled with his disregard for their safety and dignity, created an undercurrent of resentment that would prove crucial in the plots to come. The emperor's most trusted protectors would soon become the very agents of his demise. The rumors of conspiracy reached Caligula's ears, heightening his paranoia and leading to even more ruthless purges within his court. Advisors, officials, and guards were accused of treason without evidence, executed or exiled in a wave of violence meant to crush any resistance to his rule. These purges only fueled the fire of resentment, as those who survived saw the need to act before they too fell victim to Caligula's suspicions. The cycle of paranoia and betrayal grew more intense, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in which Caligula's distrust led to the very plots he feared. Key figures within Caligula's inner circle began to align with senators and influential members of the Praetorian Guard, forming a coalition dedicated to ending his rule. The conspirators, each driven by their own grievances and fears, found common ground in their desire to remove the emperor and restore stability to Rome. This coalition represented a diverse alliance, composed of men who had once held different visions for Rome, but were now united by a shared determination to end Caligula's reign of terror. The conspirators' resolve solidified as they witnessed the continued deterioration of Caligula's mental state and the chaos it inflicted on the empire. The threat within Caligula's court became an unstoppable force, as those who had once sworn loyalty to him prepared to commit the ultimate act of betrayal. The atmosphere of distrust and resentment that Caligula had cultivated now turned against him, as his own allies and protectors became his greatest enemies. This betrayal from within would ultimately lead to Caligula's downfall, as the conspiracy against him grew in both numbers and determination. The stage was set for a dramatic end to the reign of the Mad Emperor, as the plots and betrayals that had simmered for so long reached their final, inevitable conclusion. The unraveling of loyalty within Caligula's court highlighted the fragility of a rule built on fear and mistrust. His descent into paranoia and violence created a world in which betrayal became the only path to survival for those around him. The emperor, who had once commanded the devotion of Rome's elite, now faced an uprising from within, as his inner circle turned against him in a desperate attempt to save both themselves and the empire from his madness. The betrayal that would end Caligula's reign was a testament to the perils of unchecked power and the destructive impact of paranoia on even the most powerful of rulers. Part 14. The Assassination. The Fall of the Mad Emperor. On the fateful day of Caligula's assassination, a conspiracy that had long been brewing within his court came to fruition. The careful planning and collaboration among senators, members of the Praetorian Guard, and disillusioned officials culminated in a plot to end his tyrannical rule once and for all. Tensions had reached a breaking point, as the emperor's increasing paranoia, cruelty, and erratic behavior had created a climate of fear and discontent that left little room for loyalty. Those who had once served him with dedication now found themselves united in a singular goal: to kill the Mad Emperor and restore stability to Rome. As the conspirators gathered in the shadows of the palace, they carefully laid their plans, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. They knew that striking at the heart of the imperial court would require precision and coordination, as Caligula's guards were fiercely loyal, albeit increasingly disenchanted with their emperor. On January 24th, 41 AD, the conspirators prepared to act during a public event where Caligula was expected to attend, drawing a large crowd and making it easier to blend in amidst the chaos. This plan took advantage of the emperor's desire for public adoration, a need that had grown more pronounced as his reign progressed. The moment arrived, and as Caligula strode confidently through the halls of the palace, he was met with both adoration and dread. He was unaware that a group of men had conspired against him, motivated by a shared desire to end his madness and restore the glory of Rome. The first attack came unexpectedly, as one of the conspirators, Cassius Chaerea, confronted Caligula with a dagger, plunging it into the emperor's side. In a desperate struggle, the emperor fought back, but the attack had triggered a wave of violence, as other conspirators rushed in to join the fray. The attack on Caligula was swift and brutal, as the once mighty ruler fell victim to the very betrayal he had fostered within his court. As the blows rained down, Caligula realized the gravity of his situation, grasping that his reign had come to a violent and ignominious end. His cries for help went unheard amidst the tumult, as the conspirators unleashed their pent-up frustrations and anger, ensuring that the tyrant could not escape their wrath. The scene inside the palace turned chaotic as guards and attendants scrambled to understand what was happening, caught between their loyalty to the emperor and the rising tide of revolt against his reign. The betrayal had reached its zenith, and Caligula was left to face the consequences of his own actions, a tragic end to a life defined by excess and tyranny. In the aftermath of the assassination, chaos erupted in the city of Rome. News of Caligula's death spread quickly, igniting a mixture of relief, fear, and uncertainty among the populace. Citizens who had long suffered under his rule celebrated, while others were left to grapple with the reality of a power vacuum that threatened to plunge the empire into chaos. The conspirators, Once shadowy figures in the court found themselves thrust into the spotlight, each vying for their place in the new order that would emerge in the wake of Caligula's reign. The Senate, now infused with newfound power, struggled to establish control and restore order to a city that had been left reeling from the violence of the emperor's downfall. Caligula's assassination marked a turning point in Roman history, a moment when the tide of tyranny gave way to the potential for reform and renewal. The madness that had defined Caligula's rule was finally extinguished, but it left scars on the Roman psyche, serving as a reminder of the dangers of absolute power and unchecked ambition. The conspirators, having tasted success, now faced the daunting task of navigating the turbulent waters of Roman politics as they sought to create a new governance that would avoid the pitfalls of their former emperor. The legacy of Caligula would haunt Rome for generations, as the empire sought to reconcile the trauma of his rule with the hope for a brighter future. As the dust settled in the aftermath of the assassination, it became clear that Caligula's reign would be remembered not for its grandeur, but for the madness that consumed it. His life and death served as a cautionary tale, echoing through history as a warning against the perils of power unchecked by morality and reason. The story of Caligula, the Mad Emperor, came to an end, but the questions it raised about leadership, loyalty, and the very nature of power would linger long after his fall. Rome would move forward, forever shaped by the tumultuous legacy of a ruler who had pushed the limits of sanity and governance, leaving an indelible mark on the empire. The stage was now set for a new chapter in Rome's history, one that would emerge from the ashes of madness. Part 15. Legacy of Madness. The impact of Caligula's reign on Rome and beyond. The legacy of Caligula's reign extends far beyond his brutal and eccentric rule, casting a long shadow over the history of Rome and influencing the perceptions of leadership for generations to come. His transformation from a promising young leader into a figure synonymous with madness serves as a powerful reminder of the potential for corruption inherent in absolute power. Caligula's reign, marked by excess, brutality, and paranoia, left an indelible imprint on the fabric of Roman society and governance, shaping the way future leaders were viewed and how power was wielded. The stories of his tyrannical behavior became cautionary tales, warnings that would echo throughout history. In the immediate aftermath of Caligula's assassination, the empire faced a period of uncertainty as various factions vied for control and influence. The Senate, revitalized by their newfound authority, sought to restore stability and order to a realm that had been thrown into chaos by the emperor's excesses. However, the specter of Caligula loomed large over the political landscape, as the legacy of his madness served as a backdrop against which all future rulers would be measured. Leaders who followed would find themselves in a precarious position as they navigated the fine line between authority and tyranny, mindful of the lessons taught by Caligula's rule. The very fabric of Roman governance would be forever altered, as the empire sought to create systems of checks and balances to prevent the rise of another tyrant. Caligula's reign also served to illuminate the flaws within the Roman system of governance, revealing vulnerabilities that could lead to the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. The brutal realities of his rule prompted discussions about the role of the Senate, the responsibilities of the emperor, and the need for accountability among leaders. Future emperors would have to contend with the lessons learned from Caligula's downfall as they navigated the delicate balance between ambition and responsibility. This period in Roman history would ultimately inspire reforms aimed at creating a more equitable governance structure that would safeguard against the potential for despotism and excess. The stories and accounts of Caligula's rule permeated popular culture, influencing literature, art, and historical narratives for centuries to come. The image of the Mad Emperor became a powerful symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the impact of mental instability on leadership. Authors and playwrights drew on the tales of Caligula to explore themes of power, madness, and the fragility of human nature, crafting narratives that resonated across time and cultures. His story has become a touchstone in discussions about the intersection of power and sanity, providing a rich tapestry for exploration in the realms of psychology, philosophy, and political science. As historians and scholars examined Caligula's legacy, they grappled with the complexities of his character, seeking to understand the factors that contributed to his descent into madness. Was it the immense pressure of power, a hereditary predisposition to mental illness, or the isolation that often accompanies absolute authority? The exploration of these questions continues to shape our understanding of leadership and the human psyche, providing insights that remain relevant in the context of contemporary governance. Caligula's life and reign serve as a stark reminder of the responsibilities that come with power and the potential for corruption that lies within even the most charismatic leaders. In conclusion, Caligula's reign, filled with excess, brutality, and ultimately madness, left an enduring legacy that has shaped the course of history. The lessons learned from his rule echo throughout time, serving as both a warning and a source of intrigue for those who study the dynamics of power and leadership. The Mad Emperor remains a compelling figure, a testament to the complexity of human nature and the delicate balance between ambition and morality in the exercise of power. As Rome moved forward from the chaos of his reign, it did so with a newfound awareness of the fragility of order and the importance of safeguarding against the madness that can arise from unchecked ambition. Caligula's story, forever etched in the annals of history, continues to resonate, reminding us of the profound impact one individual can have on the course of an empire and the legacy they leave behind.